The last box was labeled Kitchen MISC. I slit the tape with my thumbnail and peered inside. A jumble of things we didn't know where else to put. The corkscrew, the novelty salt and pepper shakers shaped like ghosts, the roll of paper towels. The house smelled of fresh paint and old dust, a combination that was supposed to feel like a new beginning. We had driven for 2 days to get here, to this plot of land carved out of the forest, to this house that was more window than wall. Our escape. Ethan was in the yard. I watched him through the large pane of glass above the sink. He stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the unruly grass and the line of dark, dense trees that formed a wall at the edge of our property. He looked smaller out here, surrounded by so much green and brown. A muscle in his jaw was working, a tiny, rhythmic pulse I could see even from here. He'd been like that for days, tense. A wire pulled taut. I told myself it was the stress of the move, the weight of the mortgage, the exhaustion. I went out the back door, letting the screen door slap shut behind me. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. "Find any buried treasure yet?" I asked. He didn't turn around. "Just rocks, and more weeds than I can count." I knelt in one of the overgrown flower beds that flanked the small stone patio. The dirt was cool and soft. I started pulling at stray dandelions and thistles, my fingers sinking into the soil. It felt good, like I was already putting my mark on the place, taming it. My fingers brushed against something hard and cold. I dug around it, my nails scraping against metal. I pulled it free. It was a locket. Silver, or what might have been silver once, now tarnished to a deep, cloudy gray. It was oval-shaped, with a delicate, flowery pattern etched into its surface. The chain was broken. "Hey, look what I found," I said, holding it up. Ethan turned, his eyes fixed on the locket in my palm. The motion in his jaw stopped. His entire body went still for a fraction of a second, a freeze frame in the middle of a film. His face lost its color. It was a subtle shift, one I would have missed if I wasn't watching him so closely. "What is it?" I asked, my voice softer now. He took a step closer, his gaze locked on the small piece of metal. Then he blinked, and it was over. The color returned to his cheeks. He forced a small smile, must have been left by the old owners. "Throw it away." His voice was dry, the words scraping out of his throat. "No, I like it," I said, rubbing the grime off with my thumb. "It's old-fashioned." I tried to pry it open, but the hinge was fused shut with rust and time. I slipped it into the pocket of my jeans. Ethan had already turned his back to me again, facing the dark woods. He didn't say another word. That night, the dream came. It wasn't like a normal dream. There was no fuzzy logic, no strange transitions. It felt real. We were walking through a field. The ground was wet, a thick, dark mud that sucked at my boots with every step. The sky was the color of a bruise. Moonless, but a pale, sickly light illuminated everything in shades of gray. I could feel the cold air on my skin, see the plume of my breath. Ethan was beside me. I could hear his labored breathing, the same squelching sound of his boots pulling free from the mud. We weren't speaking. We were just walking, moving towards something. Far ahead, at the edge of the field, a figure stood. A woman. She was just a shape, a long, dark silhouette against the gray sky. She was perfectly still, watching us. I felt no urge to call out to her, only to keep walking, to close the distance. The mud got deeper, thicker. It clung to my legs like a living thing. I looked at Ethan. His face was a mask of effort, his eyes fixed on the woman. He was dreaming this too. I knew it, with a certainty that had no place in a dream. We were in it together. I woke with a gasp. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The room was dark, but it was our room. I could see the faint outline of the window, the unpacked boxes stacked against the wall. I was safe. A movement beside me. Ethan sat bolt upright, his chest heaving. We stared at each other in the darkness. "The field," he whispered. "The woman," I finished. My throat was tight. He let out a shaky breath, an attempt at a laugh that came out as a cough. Jesus, must be this house. New house jitters. "We had the same dream, Ethan." "It's a coincidence," he said too quickly. "We're both stressed. We talked about the yard yesterday. It just manifested." He laid back down, pulling the covers up to his chin. He was facing away from me. I stayed sitting up for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around us. The discomfort didn't recede with the sun. It clung to the morning like a film. As I pulled on a clean shirt, a sharp sting made me flinch. I looked at my forearm. A thin red line, maybe 4 inches long, ran from my wrist toward my elbow. It was perfectly straight. Along its length, tiny beads of blood had pushed through the skin. It looked like a paper cut, but deeper. I hadn't been near any paper. I hadn't hit anything. I traced a finger alongside it, feeling the raised, tender skin. I remembered the thistles in the garden, but this wasn't a ragged scratch. This was clean. Precise. I went downstairs. Ethan was in the new kitchen, standing at the counter, waiting for the coffee to brew. The morning light streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "My arm is," I started to say. He made a sharp, guttural sound. A pained grunt. He was staring at his own hand, spread flat on the white marble countertop. "Ethan?" He didn't answer. I moved to his side. There, on the back of his right hand, a red line was appearing. I watched it happen. It wasn't a cut opening up. It was more like the skin was blushing, then darkening, a line drawn by an invisible pen. Then the line parted, delicately, from the inside out. A welling of dark red blood filled the fresh wound. It was identical to the one on my arm. A perfect, clean slash. We stared at it. At his hand, then at my arm. We didn't speak. The only sound was the gurgle of the coffee maker. The machine clicked off, and the silence that followed was heavy, solid. The fear was no longer a vague feeling. It was here, in the room with us. It was on our skin. I backed away from him, toward the living room. "I'm calling the police," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. "And say what?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. "That we both got mysterious scratches. They'll think we're crazy." "This isn't normal." I grabbed my phone from the mantelpiece. The screen was dark. No service. A small, empty triangle in the corner. "No signal," I whispered. I looked at the modem on the floor. No lights. I went to the TV and pressed the power button. A flash of white static hissed from the speakers, then died. Nothing. "The storm last week must have knocked something out," Ethan said. But there was no conviction in his words. We were making excuses, building a flimsy wall of logic against something that didn't care about logic. A sound from outside made us both freeze. A loud, jarring backquote. Clang, backquote. The resonant shriek of metal on metal. It echoed across the property. I ran to the front window. The long, gravel driveway stretched down a gentle slope, ending at the main road a few hundred yards away. At the entrance stood a heavy, wrought iron gate that we had left wide open. It was now closed. "Did you close that?" I asked, my breath fogging the glass. "No," he said, standing right behind me. "I haven't been down there." We were cut off. The house, our dream of a sanctuary, was suddenly a container, an island, and we were on it. A sound. It was faint at first, coming from below. A dry, dragging noise. A rasp. It stopped, then started again. Backquote. SCCC, RRR, AAAPE. Pause. SCCC, RRR, AAAPE. Backquote. It was coming from the basement door. We both looked at the door, set in the wall of the main hallway. It was old, made of thick, dark wood. "It's probably a raccoon," Ethan said, "or a possum, got trapped down there." He was trying to convince himself, not me. Backquote. SCRA-APE. Backquote. Louder this time. It sounded like fingernails dragging slowly across rough, unfinished wood. Ethan walked past me, his movements stiff. He grabbed the aluminum baseball bat we'd used to prop a door open while painting. He held it in both hands, his knuckles white. "Stay here," he said. His eyes met mine for a second. They were wide with a fear he couldn't hide. I didn't move. I stood at the mouth of the hallway, listening. I heard his soft footsteps on the hardwood floor. The dry scrape from below stopped. The house was silent again. A waiting, listening silence. I held my breath. I heard the faint click of the old brass doorknob turning in his hand. He pulled the door open. It swung inward with a low groan. I could see him from my vantage point. He was a silhouette against the dark, rectangular void of the basement entrance. He stood there for a long moment, peering down. The bat was held ready at his side. Nothing. No sound. No movement. The air from the basement that drifted up the stairs was cold and smelled of earth and mildew. He lowered the bat slightly. I saw his shoulders slump with a small measure of relief. He gave a quick, final look into the blackness, then turned back toward me. He took one step away from the open doorway back into the light of the hall. The moment his foot touched the floor, the sound erupted again. It wasn't a slow scrape this time. It was a frantic, furious scratching, right at the base of the stairs, just behind him. A sound of desperate, clawing rage. Before he could turn, before I could scream a warning, the heavy basement door slammed shut. It wasn't a swing, it was a concussive blast of force. Backquote. Unpump. Backquote. The sound was violent and absolute, shaking the floorboards beneath my feet. Plaster dust puffed from the doorframe. He was gone, plunged into the suffocating, silent dark. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, from behind the solid wood, came his scream. It wasn't loud, but it was raw and full of a terror I had never heard from another human being. A short, sharp cry of agony. And then, silence again. The final, awful silence of the door. The silence was a solid thing. It pressed in on my ears. I stared at the door, the thick, dark wood that had swallowed him. My knuckles were white where I gripped the frame of the hallway entrance. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The scream was gone, but the shape of it was still in the air. A short, sharp tear in the fabric of the morning. My legs finally worked. I ran at the door, my shoulder hitting the wood with a jarring thud that sent a shock of pain up my arm. I recoiled, cradling it. It was like hitting stone. I fumbled for the old brass knob. It felt cold, inert. I twisted it. It didn't budge. I twisted it the other way. Nothing. The lock was thrown. Ethan. My voice was a thin, useless sound. Ethan, answer me. Silence. I hammered my fists against the door. The impacts were loud in the hallway, but the wood felt dense, dead. It absorbed the sound. Ethan! The bat. The aluminum bat was on the floor where he'd dropped it when the door slammed. No, he hadn't dropped it. He had taken it with him. He was in there, in the dark, with a baseball bat. And something else. I rattled the knob again, pulling with all my weight. My feet slipped on the hardwood floor. It was useless. I backed away, my eyes wide, scanning the hallway for something, anything. My gaze landed on the mantelpiece in the living room, an old, heavy iron poker from the fireplace set. I ran, grabbed it. It was heavier than I expected. I returned to the door. Just as I raised the poker to try and pry at the frame, I heard it. A faint click from the other side. The sound of a mechanism releasing. The knob jiggled. I froze. The poker held halfway in the air. The door groaned and swung open, inward, into the blackness of the basement. Ethan stood there. Not on the stairs, but on the landing, just inside the threshold. He wasn't holding the bat. His hands were empty, hanging at his sides. His face was the color of ash. His eyes were huge, fixed on something I couldn't see past him. He took one slow step forward, out of the dark and into the light of the hall. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. I dropped the poker. It hit the floor with a loud clang. I rushed to him, grabbing his arms. They were cold. What happened? Oh my God, what happened? Are you hurt? He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was still locked on the empty space behind him. I don't know, he breathed. The words had no air behind them. I was on the floor. I couldn't move. Then the lock just turned. He finally looked at me, and I saw the raw terror in his eyes. He grabbed me, pulling me into a hug that wasn't comforting. It was desperate. A drowning man clinging to a piece of wood. I could feel his heart hammering against my own chest, a fast, sick rhythm. I held onto him, my face pressed into his shoulder. The house was quiet again. The open basement exhaled a smell of cold earth and damp stone. Maybe it was the draft, I said, the words feeling stupid even as they left my mouth. This house is old, the frame could be warped and... I trailed off. We both knew it was a lie. We were building a wall of wet paper against a flood. He pulled back, his hands still on my shoulders. We need to clean those cuts. His voice was low, forced. He was trying to find a normal thing to do, a task. Something to anchor us. We went to the kitchen. The bright morning light felt wrong, intrusive. He sat me down on one of the new stools. He got the first aid kit from under the sink. We didn't speak. The only sounds were the crinkle of the antiseptic wipes packaging and the soft hiss as he dabbed at the long, red line on my forearm. I flinched. The sting was sharp. "Easy," he mumbled. He was concentrating, his brow furrowed. Under the harsh light, I could see the line on the back of his hand more clearly. It was a perfect, angry red incision. He finished with my arm and started to open another wipe for himself. "Let me," I said, taking it from him. I held his hand. His skin was still cold. I gently cleaned the wound. The alcohol made the edges of the cut stand out, clean and precise. But there was something else. Inside the gash, nestled against the pearly white of the tissue beneath the skin, was a tiny, dark speck. "You have something in it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I leaned closer. I tried to pick it out with my fingernail, but it was wedged deep. It was gritty. I scraped it free. It was a minuscule particle, dark and rough. I held it on the tip of my finger. It was a grain of soil. Rich, black soil. "Where did this come from?" I asked, looking up at him. His eyes widened. He looked from the speck on my finger to the cut on his hand, then to my arm. He grabbed my forearm, his grip too tight, and brought it close to his face. "Oh, God," he said. He ran his thumb over my wound, not gently. I felt the same hard, gritty texture. He pulled his thumb away, and there, under his nail, were more dark grains of dirt. We hadn't fallen. We hadn't touched any dirt since I'd found the locket yesterday. The wounds had appeared on our skin. From the inside out, they had come with the soil already in them. "That's it," he said, his voice hard. He let go of my arm and stood up, knocking the stool back. "We're leaving. Now, we get in the car, we drive to the sheriff's office in town, and we don't stop." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The idea of leaving, of putting this house behind us, was the first good thing I had felt all day. Ethan went to the hallway and came back with the baseball bat. He held it in his right hand, the one with the cut on it. His knuckles were white. "The gate," I remembered. "It's closed." "I'll drive through it," he said, his jaw set. "Let's go." He led the way to the front door. He put his left hand on the knob, then paused. He looked back at me. His fear was still there, but it was mixed with a new, hard determination. He took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. A powerful, overwhelming stench of damp, decomposing earth. The kind of smell that comes from digging too deep. It was thick and cloying. We both recoiled. The doorway framed a picture that made no sense. Our porch, the wooden planks we had planned to stain a cheerful cedar color, was gone. The stone steps leading down to the gravel path were gone. The welcome mat was gone. Everything was covered. A thick, uniform blanket of black, wet mud stretched from our doorstep out into the yard. It was smooth, glistening, and looked deep. It was as if a dump truck had backed up to our house in the dead of night and emptied its contents, perfectly and silently. We stared. The baseball bat hung limply in Ethan's hand. What the fuck is this?" he whispered. The words were for himself, not for me. The mud was perfectly still. It swallowed the morning light. It was a physical barrier, an undeniable horror that logic couldn't explain away. No storm could do this. No animal. This was deliberate. This was placed here. For us. My eyes scanned the surface of the mud, looking for a footprint, a tire track. Any sign of who or what had done this. There was nothing. Just the slick, black expanse. Then I saw it. A ripple. Near the center of the muddy patch, a slight disturbance on the surface, like a stone dropped in a pond. "Did you see that?" I breathed. Ethan's grip tightened on the bat. "See what?" And then we both saw it. The mud began to swell upwards in one spot. It was slow, deliberate. A mound was forming. From the peak of the mound, something pale broke the surface. It looked like a sickly white root. It pushed higher. It was a finger, thin, bone-white, with a blackened, broken nail. Then another finger pushed through beside it, and another. A whole hand, palm up, rising from the muck. The fingers twitched, curling slightly, as if reaching for something. I made a sound, A choked gasp. I stumbled backward into the hall. Another mound formed a few feet away from the first. A second hand broke through the surface. Its twin. They were pale and thin, the hands of the woman from our dream. Ethan didn't move backward. He moved forward. A sound came from his throat, a low animal growl of pure rage and terror. He took a step onto the threshold, raised the aluminum bat high over his head, and brought it down with all his strength onto the first hand. The impact was a wet, heavy thud, not the crack of bone. The hand didn't bleed or break. It burst. It splattered apart into clumps of wet soil and what looked like dark, rotting fibers. It just dissolved back into the mud it came from. The second hand began to claw at the air, the fingers opening and closing faster. Ethan screamed, a wordless yell of fury, and swung again, hitting the second hand. Thud. It too collapsed into a spray of black earth. He didn't stop. He started beating the mud where the hands had been, over and over. Estiv pru. Make thud. The bat was slick with wet dirt. He was breathing in great, ragged gulps, his face twisted. He was not just destroying them, he was trying to kill the memory of them. Finally, he stopped. He stood there, panting, the bat held low, dripping black mud onto the clean wood of the entryway. He was trembling. The porch was a mess of disturbed soil. The pristine surface was gone, replaced by a battlefield of craters and splatters. We stood in the silence, listening to the sound of our own breathing. The air still smelled of rot. Something glinted in the mud where the first hand had been. A small metallic object, half buried in the churned earth. It was the locket. I walked forward slowly, my feet numb. I stooped down and picked it up. The mud clung to it. I wiped it on my jeans. The fall, or the violence, or something else, had done what my fingers could not. The hinge had broken. The locket was open. I looked inside. I expected to see a faded portrait, a lock of hair. But both oval frames were empty, except, in the right-hand depression, tucked neatly into the silver frame, was a tiny folded piece of paper. It was yellowed and brittle. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely unfold it. I managed to flatten it out on my palm. There was writing on it, a few words, written in a shaky but familiar cursive. It was an address. 1428 Hemlock Lane, Northwood Creek. I read it twice. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my old address. It was Ethan's, the one from before I knew him, the house he grew up in. I looked up from the locket, from the impossible message in my hand. I looked at my husband. He was still staring at the mud, his chest heaving. The man I loved. The man I had driven across the country with to build a new life. He was a stranger. He was a gaping hole where my certainty used to be. The horror was no longer just in the house, or in the yard. It was standing right in front of me, holding a baseball bat. The aluminum bat slipped from Ethan's fingers. It hit the wooden floorboards of the entryway, not with a clang, but with a dull, wet thud. It left a smear of black mud on the clean planks. The sound was small, but in the silence that had fallen between us, it was as loud as a gunshot. My own hand was clamped around the locket. The silver was cold against my palm. The tiny, folded piece of paper inside it felt like a shard of glass. I didn't need to look at it again. The address was burned into my vision. 1428 Hemlock Lane, Northwood Creek. I took a step back, into the house. My heel connected with the leg of the hallway table. I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on him. On his face. The rage was gone. The terror was gone. All that was left was a gray, hollow mask. He was looking at the locket in my hand. He knew what it was. He knew what was inside. What is this? My voice didn't sound like my own. It was flat. A simple question of fact. There was no heat in it. No accusation. Just a demand for data. He shook his head. A slow, minute motion. I don't know. Don't lie to me, Ethan. The words came out just as flat. I held up my hand, showing him the open locket. The tiny paper was a pale rectangle against the dark silver. This is your address. Your old house. Why is it in this locket? The locket I found buried in our yard. It must be a coincidence. He took a half step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Leah, I swear. The lie hung in the air. It was so thin, so pathetic. And then the house responded. Back quote. Click. Back quote. The lamp on the end table beside the sofa went out. Back quote. Click. Click. Back quote. The overhead light in the hall flickered twice, then died. We were thrown into the gray gloom of the overcast morning, the only light coming from the open doorway and the obscene field of mud beyond it. Ethan froze. His eyes darted up to the deadlight fixture. Back quote. HHSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSS The scream was a blizzard of churning black and white static. The hiss was loud, filling the room, abrasive and constant. It was an old television, one we'd bought from a second-hand store in town. It had a dial, not a remote. It was impossible. From the speakers, beneath the wall of static, a new sound emerged. It was a whisper. Distorted. Stretched and compressed by the electronics, so it was neither male nor female, just a cadence of breath and sound. My ah! My ah! The voice was a ragged loop. Ethan stared at the television, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked like an animal that had heard the snap of a trap nearby. Who is Maya? I asked. The name came from nowhere. An instinct. A piece of a dream. Or maybe it was what the electronic whisper was trying to form. His head snapped back to me. His face was slick with sweat. What? I don't know anyone named Maya. The second lie was heavier than the first, and the house, or whatever was in it with us, answered again. A new sound cut through the static hiss. Music. It came from the kitchen. The small, retro-styled radio on the counter, the one I'd bought because it matched the new curtains, had turned on. A sad, slow song played, a simple acoustic guitar, and a woman's mournful voice. I didn't recognize it, but Ethan did. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He looked past me, towards the kitchen, as if he could see the radio through the wall. He recognized the song. I could see it in the sudden, sharp terror that finally broke through his gray mask. The whispering from the television changed. It was clearer now, coherent. It spoke over the music from the other room, a counterpoint of malice. This was our song, Ethan. The voice was still distorted, still a caricature of human speech, but the words were unmistakable. You played it for me, the first time, right here. The whisper gained a cruel, sing-song quality. You held my hand. You said you would never let go. Do you remember, Ethan? Do you remember Maya? He made a sound, a low, guttural noise, like he'd been punched in the stomach. He stumbled backward, away from the television, away from the voice, away from me. All of it, all the strangeness. The dreams, the shared wounds, the door locking itself, the mud, the hands. It wasn't the house, it was him. He had pulled this darkness here. He had opened the door and invited it into our lives. He had built our home on top of it. The man I loved was a lock, and something terrible was the key. Tell me, I said. The flatness was gone. My voice shook now, a low tremor of revulsion. Tell me, now. He collapsed. It wasn't a gradual lowering. His legs just gave out. He fell to his knees on the hardwood floor with a heavy final sound. He put his hands over his face, his shoulders shaking. The sounds that came from him were not words. They were ripping, wet sobs of a man whose entire world had been torn down to the studs. He stayed like that for a long time. I didn't move. I stood and watched him. The television hissed. The radio played its sad song. The gray light filled the room. The mud waited outside. I was a spectator to the complete and total disintegration of my husband. Finally, he lowered his hands. His face was a wreck of tears, and snot, and despair. He looked at the floor, not at me. Her name was Maya, he said, his voice raw and broken. She was before you, a long time ago. He took a ragged breath. The confession spilled out of him, a torrent of poison he'd held in for years. He told me they were young. He told me he'd bought this land, just the empty plot, with a small inheritance. It was his dream, his future. He brought her here one night to show her, to propose. She said no, he whispered to the floorboards. She was going to leave, to a different state, for college. She said it was over. They argued. He begged. She was firm. She turned to walk back to the car. I grabbed her arm, Ethan choked out. I just wanted her to listen. She pulled away. She tripped. I pushed her. I don't know. It happened so fast. He looked up at me then, for the first time. His eyes were pleading, desperate for an absolution I could not give. There was a rock, he said, from an old foundation. She just fell back. Her head hit the rock. There was no sound, just the way she landed. She didn't move, Leah. She didn't get up. The room was cold. I felt the chill of the damp earth from the open door seep into my bones. He had killed her. Right here. On this land. I panicked, he sobbed, the words dissolving into spasms. I didn't call anyone. I couldn't. I knew what it would look like. I knew. So he had dug. In the dark, with his bare hands and a tire iron from the trunk of his car, he dug a shallow, desperate grave, and he put her in it. Then he drove away. He sold the land a week later for a loss. He moved to a new city. He met me. Years passed. The guilt festered. He told me he couldn't live with it. He needed to do something. Make it right. And in his twisted, broken mind, making it right meant coming back. It meant buying the land again, under a new name. It meant building a beautiful house, our house, directly on top of her grave. A monument. A mausoleum. A grotesque act of penance so he could be near her. To protect her. To keep her secret safe. I just wanted to give her a home, he cried, the last words a pathetic whimper. The locket. It must have been hers. He must have buried it with her. A final, secret token. The television hissed. The radio was silent. The confession was over. It lay in the air between us, a toxic radioactive thing. I looked at the man on the floor. The stranger kneeling in the ruins of our life. The horror wasn't in the walls or under the ground. It was him. It had always been him. Then, a new sensation. A sharp, insistent burn. It was in my left forearm. The long, clean cut that had appeared this morning. The place where he'd told me he'd found grains of soil. I looked down. The skin around the cut was red, inflamed. It throbbed in time with my own heart. But there was something else. Protruding from the center of the wound, from the deepest part of the gash, was something new. It was thin. It was black. It glistened faintly in the gray light. It looked like a piece of dark thread. Or the leg of an insect. I reached down with my right hand, my fingers trembling. I pinched the end of it. It felt stiff, wiry. I tried to pull it out. A flash of white-hot pain shot up my arm. It didn't come out. It was anchored to something deep inside me. I pulled harder. My teeth grit. The skin tented around the black filament. I could feel it tugging on the muscle and tissue beneath. It was a root. A tiny, black, fibrous root. And it was growing inside of me. It had been planted there. I let go. I stared at my arm, at the alien thing emerging from my own flesh. This wasn't a ghost's curse. This wasn't a memory. This was a physical violation. Someone or something had put this inside me. The soil in the wound wasn't the point. It was just the camouflage for the seed. I looked from the black root in my arm to the weeping murderer on my floor. The mud outside wasn't a warning. The hands weren't a plea. The voice on the TV wasn't a ghost. It was a game. A sick, elaborate stage play. And the performance had only just begun. We weren't being haunted. We were being prepared. I flinched back from him, yanking my hand away as if his skin were hot metal. The motion was so violent it sent a fresh spike of pain up my arm from the wound, from the black thing rooted in my flesh. He didn't seem to notice. He was a heap on the floorboards, a collection of shuddering shoulders and broken, wet noises that were no longer human words. The sound was just noise now, like the static from the dead television. Irrelevant. I stared at the space between my shoes and his kneeling form. It wasn't just a few feet of polished wood. It was a canyon. A grave. Our dream house was a headstone he had meticulously carved, and the man I had married was the body buried beneath it. I backed away slowly, one step at a time. My heel bumped the wall. I stopped. There was nowhere else to go. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my knees pulled up to my chest. I watched him, The lamp on the end table was dark. The overhead light was dead. The television screen was a sheet of gray. The little radio in the kitchen was silent. The confession had sucked all the energy from the room. All that was left was the gray morning light coming through the open door, illuminating the field of mud that was our yard. His yard. Her yard. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time had stopped working. The clock hands were frozen at the moment he said her name. Maya. The sun didn't move in the sky. It was a static pewter disk behind a permanent bank of clouds. He cried until he couldn't anymore. The sobs became dry, rattling hitches in his throat. I stared at the root in my arm. It didn't move. It just existed. A dark, alien punctuation mark in the story of my skin. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. I felt nothing. A cold, clean absence. The horror was too large to have an emotion attached to it. It was a fact, like gravity. He killed a woman and buried her where I now sleep. A root is growing out of my arm. These were just things that were true now. Eventually, the gray light outside began to fail. It wasn't a sunset, it was just a slow draining of color from the world, leaving a deeper, heavier shade of gray. The house grew dark around us. Neither of us moved to turn on a light that would not work. We sat in our separate corners of the mausoleum he had built. He on the floor where he had fallen, me against the wall by the stairs. The silence was complete now. Even his breathing was shallow, barely a whisper of air. I didn't feel my eyes close. There was no gentle drift into sleep. One moment I was looking at the vague outline of his shape in the gloom. The next, the shape wasn't there. The walls weren't there. The floor beneath me was gone. It wasn't a dream. A dream is something your mind creates. This was a place we were taken to. There was cold air on my skin. The smell of pine and damp earth. I felt a hand. A large, desperate hand, clamped around my upper arm. It was his hand. Ethan's hand. But I was not me. We were not us. We were her. We were Maya. We were inside her skin, looking out through her eyes, feeling the terror that was not our own but now belonged to us completely. We saw his face, younger, unlined by years of guilt, but twisted now by a raw, boyish desperation. His mouth was moving, forming words we could hear as if from a great distance, begging, pleading. Don't go. Please, Maya. Don't do this. We felt her body pull away, a firm, final motion. The decision was made. The future he had planned on this very spot was dissolving in front of him, and he couldn't stand it. We felt the grip on her, our arm tighten. Then it wasn't a grip. It was a shove. A hard, frustrated, angry push. It wasn't a long fall. It was clumsy, ankle twisting on uneven ground, the backwards stumble. There was a single, shocking moment of weightlessness. The world tipped sideways. The dark shapes of the trees spun against a starless sky. Then, impact. It was not a dull thud. It was a crack. A sharp, wet, final sound at the base of the skull. Not loud. Just an internal, definitive snap. Vision flared white, then went dark at the edges. There was no pain. Just a sudden, overwhelming numbness, a disconnect from the limbs. We were on the ground, looking up. We saw him standing over us, his face a mask of shock, his hand still outstretched. We saw the shock curdle into panic. He took a step back. Then another. He turned and ran, a frantic, crashing sound through the underbrush. He was gone. We were alone. Lying on our back, staring at the empty sky. The numbness was spreading, a cold tide rising from the ground up. This was it. The end of the memory. The moment of death. But it wasn't. The thing that happened next was worse. The ground beneath our back shifted. It was not a tremor. It was a flex, like the muscle of a large animal waking from a long sleep. We couldn't move our head, couldn't scream, but our eyes were wide open. We saw it. From the base of the giant, ancient oak that dominated the property, things were moving in the dirt. At first they looked like shadows, but they had substance. They were thin, dark tendrils, the color of wet soil, sliding through the fallen leaves. They were roots. But they did not move like roots. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, like fingers stretching. They reached the body. Our body. We felt the first one touch our ankle. It was cool and firm. It coiled around, not with force, but with a strange intimacy. Another slid up the leg of our jeans. More came. They found our wrists, our waist, our shoulders. They were not strangling. They were embracing. We felt them press down, and the ground beneath us gave way. The soil became soft, yielding. We were sinking. The roots were pulling us down, into the earth. Deeper. The dirt was a slow, rising tide. It filled our ears, our mouth. A final, silent scream was swallowed by the cold, black soil. The last thing we saw before the darkness took us was not the memory of Ethan's panicked face, but the intricate, living web of black roots, covering us like a shroud, pulling us down into the heart of the land. The terror wasn't of the man who had pushed us, it was of the thing that was claiming us. The world went black. Not the black of a closed room, but the weight of solid matter. The pressure was immense. It was in my chest, on my eyes, in my skull. I couldn't breathe. We couldn't breathe. We were trapped. Buried. The dream had changed. We were no longer observers. We were here, in the dark, with her. The feeling of soil was everywhere. Gritty, cold, and final. It was in my mouth. My lungs burned for air that wasn't there. Panic was a useless, thrashing thing. Then came the sound. It was not Maya's voice. It wasn't human at all. It was a hum. A deep, resonant vibration that was not heard with the ears but felt in the bones. It came from the dirt, from the roots, from the very substance of the place. It was ancient. It spoke no words, but we understood it perfectly. It was a vibration of pure, endless need, a hunger that had been waiting for a very long time. It had been fed once, and it wanted more. The roots that held Maya's body were just its tongue and teeth. The land itself was the stomach. I woke up with a gasp that tore at my throat. I was on the floor, against the wall. The house was pitch black. My lungs ached. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to break out. I could still feel the phantom pressure of the dirt. I could still taste it. Across the room, a strangled choking sound. Ethan. He was awake too. He was scrambling on his hands and knees, making small, terrified animal noises. He had seen it. He had been there. He had felt it. The full weight of the revelation hit me. Not just the dream, but everything. The wounds that mirrored each other. The dreams we had shared before. The soil in the cuts. Maya wasn't haunting us. She wasn't the voice on the television. She wasn't the thing that wrote on the wall. She was a prisoner. A messenger. An echo. Used by something else. Her pain was the lure. Her memory was the stage. I pushed myself up, my muscles shaking. My voice was a raw whisper, scraped from my throat. I started, the words catching. Ethan froze, his head snapping up in the darkness. I could just make out the pale oval of his face. She was trying to warn us. The moment the words left my mouth, the house answered. It was not a whisper. It was not a flicker of a light. It was a single, sharp report. Loud as a rifle shot, it came from the living room. It made us both jump. A sound of immense pressure, finding a sudden release. Piang. Another one. From the kitchen window, crack. The dining room. A spider web of lines bloomed across the large pane of glass in the living room window, catching the faint moonlight. A starburst fracture appeared on the glass of the kitchen door. The sound echoed, one after another, a percussive symphony of destruction. Every single window in the house. The glass wasn't shattering and falling out. It was cracking from the outside in, as if an invisible giant was pressing its hands against our home, squeezing. The web of fractures grew denser, the lines branching out, meeting each other, covering every inch of glass until we could no longer see out. We were inside a breaking egg. The pressure was real, and it was getting stronger. The sound was an end point, a period on a sentence I didn't want to read. The house settled into a new state of being, a chorus of faint ticking noises as the millions of tiny fractures in the glass adjusted to their own new stress. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. The air was thick with ozone and the impossible fact of what had just happened. Across the room, Ethan was a dark shape, frozen on all fours. A mammal caught in the headlights of an oncoming reality. I could feel the thrum of my own pulse in my teeth, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. A tremor ran through my legs. I had to move. I had to see. My feet felt disconnected from my brain, two lead weights I had to command one at a time. Left foot forward. Right foot forward. I crossed the space between the wall and the large living room window. Ethan's head lifted, tracking my movement. No words passed between us. He was a man who had confessed to a killing. I was the woman whose arm was a vessel for some dark botany. We were not husband and wife anymore. We were two animals in the same trap, and the trap was closing. I reached the window. My hand, the uninjured one, hovered inches from the glass. I didn't touch it. I was afraid it would disintegrate into a shower of razor dust. A web of fine, silver lines covered the entire surface, catching the thin moonlight from outside. It was a shattered map of a country I did not recognize. I looked past the cracks, to the yard, the mud field, the skeletal trees, the ancient, hulking oak that squatted in the center of it all like a fat dark god. My gaze followed the lines in the glass. They weren't random. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of my terror. They were not just cracks. They were patterns. Like frost on a winter pane, but with a horrifying, deliberate geometry. From the edges of the window frame, the lines snaked inward. They forked and branched. They thickened and thinned. I took a step back, my eyes wide, scanning from the living room window to the dining room window, then to the smaller panes on the kitchen door. The same pattern was everywhere, a network, a system. They all converged, flowing from the edges of the house inward. No, not inward, downward. They all seemed to point toward the ground, toward the base of the house, toward the one dominant shape in the darkness outside. They looked like roots. "It's not in the house," I whispered. The sound of my own voice was a foreign thing in the room. A dry rasp. Ethan flinched. His eyes, wide and white in the gloom, were fixed on me. "What?" he breathed. I felt a new kind of dread, one that was colder and vastly larger than the fear of a ghost. The terror of containment. The windows, the cracks. They're all pointing to the oak tree. My logic was a thin, trembling thread in a hurricane of chaos, but it was there. "It's not trying to get in." My voice cracked on the last word. "It's holding us in." I turned from the window to face the center of the room. I looked at Ethan, then at the floorboards between us. "It is the house," I said, the realization landing with the weight of a coffin lid. "It's the land." The moment the words were spoken, the house agreed. A low groan started from beneath our feet. It was not the sound of a house settling. It was the sound of old wood being bent past its breaking point. The groan of a great ship's hull tearing apart at sea. We both snapped our heads down. A long, dark line appeared between two of the floorboards at the center of the room. It widened. Sawdust and splinters pushed up from the crack. It was not a gap. Something was pushing up from below. The line lengthened, racing across the floor toward the kitchen, then branching off toward the stairs. More lines appeared, a web of dark separation cracking the polished surface of our home. Then came the smell. It was not the smell of dust or old wood. It was the smell of a cellar that had been sealed for a century. The smell of damp stone, of things rotting in the absence of light. A thick, heavy smell of wet earth and decay. From the widening cracks in the floor, the smell billowed up, thick and cloying. It was the smell from the dream, the smell of the grave. The floor beneath me bowed upwards, a gentle swell that was profoundly wrong. I stumbled back, my hand flying out to the wall for support. My fingers met a surface that was no longer dry plaster. It was slick, cold and greasy. I snatched my hand back with a gasp, looking at my fingertips. They were coated in a thick, black film. It glistened in the faint light like crude oil. I looked at the wall. It was sweating. Dark, viscous beads of the same fluid were weeping from the pores in the paint, coalescing and running down in slow, silent rivulets. The walls were crying black tears. The floor was breathing. "Sarah!" Ethan's voice was a choked plea. He was scrambling backward on his hands and knees, away from the center of the room where the floor was now visibly warping, the planks groaning and popping their nails. The dark lines between them had widened into channels, and in their depths I could see it. Not subflooring, not foundation, just dirt, wet, black earth. The house had no foundations. It was just a thin skin of wood stretched over the soil. A sudden, violent thrash against the living room window made us both cry out. It wasn't pressure this time. It was an impact. A heavy, furious blow from outside. Something large and solid had hit the already fractured glass, a branch from the sprawling, overgrown bush that grew near the house. It struck again. And again. A frenzied, rhythmic battery. Whomp, whomp, whomp. On the fourth blow, the shattered integrity of the glass gave way. It didn't just break, it exploded inward. A deafening crash of glass and a spray of wood from the window frame filled the room. A blast of cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the scent of mud and torn leaves. Before the last shard of glass had finished skittering across the floor, the thing that had broken it came through the opening. It wasn't a branch, not anymore. It was a limb, a dark, whipping appendage, a dozen feet long, covered in thorns the size of my thumb. It moved with a snake's speed and purpose, lashing through the air, knocking over a lamp with a porcelain shriek. It was a tentacle made of wood and fury. It thrashed once, twice, then shot forward, straight for me. I didn't have time to scream. I only had time to throw myself sideways. The limb whipped past my head, the wind of its passage cold on my cheek. It slammed into the wall where I had just been standing, gouging a deep furrow in the weeping plaster. It retracted with a sound of tearing wood and struck again, this time lower. I felt it before I saw it, a line of fire across my thigh. It wrapped around my leg. The thorns, sharp as filed steel, tore through my jeans and bit deep into my flesh. A raw, animal cry was ripped from my throat. It was a hold of impossible strength. It tightened, and I was pulled off my feet, my body dragged across the floor like a sack of grain. The floorboards scraped my back. Splinters dug into my skin. "No!" Ethan's roar was primal. He scrambled, launching himself forward. No longer a broken man, but a desperate animal defending its territory. He grabbed my shoulders, his weight a sudden, jarring anchor against the pull. His fingers dug into my arms. I clawed at the floor, my nails scraping against the polished wood, finding no purchase. "Help me!" I screamed, my voice shredding. The limb was pulling with a steady, inexorable force, dragging both of us toward the shattered window, toward the dark, hungry maw of the night. It was a tug-of-war against the house itself. Ethan grunted, his feet sliding, his face a mask of straining muscle and sheer terror. The thorns in my leg ground deeper, a unique and searing agony with every inch we lost. We were going to be pulled out, pulled into the mud, pulled toward the oak tree. My mind went white with pain and panic. My right arm, the one with the wound, was pinned beneath me. As Ethan pulled and the limb pulled, my weight shifted, pressing the arm hard against the floor. A spike of fresh, different pain shot up from the wound. And then, heat, a bloom of intense heat, spreading out from the dark root embedded in my flesh. It wasn't the heat of an infection. It was the dry, clean heat of a live current. Through the fabric of my sleeve, I saw it. The black, alien punctuation in my skin began to glow. It wasn't a bright, holy light. It was a dull, sickly, phosphorescent green, the color of deep-sea things that live without sun. The light pulsed, a weak but steady heartbeat of defiance. The limb clutching my leg convulsed. A sound, a high-pitched hiss like water on a hot iron, came from where the thorns were buried in my skin. The limb, which a second ago had been taut with power, suddenly went slack. It sizzled. Black smoke, smelling of burnt sap, rose from its surface. With a violent, spasmodic jerk, it recoiled as if it had touched a live wire. It uncoiled from my leg and whipped back out the broken window, thrashing wildly in the darkness before disappearing into the bush. The sudden release of tension sent Ethan and me tumbling backward. We collapsed in a heap of tangled limbs and gasping breaths. For a moment, we just lay there on the filthy, sweating floor, chests heaving. The room was silent again, save for our ragged breathing and the faint, wet dripping of the walls. My leg was a universe of throbbing pain, but my attention was fixed on my right arm. The green glow was fading, retreating back into the blackness of the root until it was gone. The heat subsided, leaving only the familiar ache. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. Ethan did the same. We weren't looking at each other, we weren't looking at the broken window. We were both staring at my arm, at the place the light had been. It wasn't just a wound from the ground. It wasn't just a mark of the house's sickness. It was a defense. A piece of her, of Maya, left inside me when the dream pulled me under. An antibody against the land that had consumed her. The realization hung in the air between us, as sharp and clear as a shard of broken glass. She wasn't just warning us, she was fighting with us. We existed in the wreckage. The air, thick with a smell of ozone and burnt sap, was a physical weight in my lungs. My leg was a map of new pain. A series of deep, fiery punctures where the thorns had dug in. Ethan and I were a tangle of limbs on the floor, our breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. The house was an abattoir, the walls weeping black fluid, the floor a broken shell over the dark earth. I pushed myself up, my good arm trembling from the effort. My eyes were locked on my right arm, the arm that had glowed. The skin was calm now, the flesh around the embedded root just a discolored bruise. But I had felt it. The heat. The power. A defense I didn't know I had. Ethan pushed himself up beside me, his gaze following mine. The space between us was no longer filled with his confession or my shock. It was filled with this new, terrifying fact. Maya, I said. The name felt strange on my tongue, a piece of a life that wasn't mine. It was not a question. It was a statement, a diagnosis. He didn't need to answer. His face, streaked with grime and sweat, collapsed. Not in guilt this time, but in a kind of awful understanding. The logic was insane, but it was the only thing that held any shape in the chaos. The house, the land, it had taken her, but a piece of her resistance had been left behind. In the bad dream. In me. The root in my arm wasn't just an infection from the land, it was an inoculation. An antibody from a previous victim, fighting the disease that had killed her. She wasn't trying to hurt us, she was trying to stop this. A new thought, sharp and clear, cut through the pain. It was a desperate gamble, a Hail Mary thrown in the face of oblivion. I looked at Ethan, my eyes pleading. We have to get her out. He stared at me, his own eyes wide. What? The dream, I said, my voice low and urgent. She showed us, she was buried, under the oak. My gaze flicked toward the gaping hole of the window, toward the hulking darkness of the tree outside. If we can get her out, if we can free her, maybe this thing loses its anchor. Maybe it goes back to sleep. I didn't know if I believed it, but believing it was better than the alternative, which was to lie here on the floor and wait for the house to finish swallowing us. For Ethan, it was something else. I saw it on his face. Not hope. Atonement. A single, impossible chance to undo the edge of a monstrous wrong. He didn't speak. He just gave a sharp, definitive nod. His jaw was set. He was no longer the broken man from an hour ago. He was a man with a final, terrible purpose. He got to his feet and offered me a hand. I took it, and he pulled me up. My injured leg threatened to buckle, but I forced my weight onto it. The pain was a grounding thing. We stood for a moment in the center of the demolished room, two survivors on a raft made of their own broken home. The shed, he said. His voice was rough. Shovels. We moved. Each step was a conscious effort. I limped heavily, my hand pressed against the bleeding wounds on my thigh. The floorboards, warped and split, shifted under our weight. The thick, earthy smell rose from the gaps, the very breath of the soil beneath us. We navigated through the debris, past the overturned lamp and the glittering sea of broken glass. The kitchen door hung on one hinge. We pushed through it, into the small utility room that led to the back door. The back door opened into the night. We left it ajar, a sliver of less intense darkness against the absolute black of the house. The shed was a small, flimsy structure about 20 yards away, a dark cube against a slightly less dark sky. Ethan went first. I followed, my eyes scanning the yard. The ground was soft and wet, the air was cold. The shed door creaked open. Ethan reached inside, fumbling along the wall. Light switch is here somewhere. His hand patted against rough wood. He found it. A click. Nothing happened. Bulb must be out, he muttered, more to himself than to me. He stepped inside, disappearing into the black doorway. I stood watch, my back to the weeping house. The silence was immense. Every drip of moisture from a leaf sounded like a footstep. Got one, I heard his voice from inside the shed. A scraping sound, the metallic tell of a shovel head against a concrete floor. He emerged from the darkness holding a long-handled spade. He handed it to me. The wood was cold and smooth in my good hand. Where's the other one, I asked. Should be right next to it. Hang on. He went back in. I heard him moving things. A lawnmower being shifted. A stack of terracotta pots clattering. What the hell? His voice was a low growl of frustration. I know it's here. I put them both here. Ethan? He came back out, empty-handed. His silhouette was tense. It's not there. The other shovel is gone. A cold finger traced its way down my spine. What do you mean, gone? I mean, it's not fucking there, Sarah, he snapped, his voice tight with a new kind of fear, the fear of being toyed with. I put them both right here, side by side. We stood there for a heartbeat, the silence stretching. It wasn't just a missing shovel, it was a message, a move in a game we didn't understand. Okay, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor I felt inside. Okay, we'll take turns. He nodded, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a grim resolve. We turned back toward the house. We had to pass it to get to the oak tree. As we approached the back door we'd left open, my eyes fell on something. Propped against the wall right beside the doorway was a second shovel. Its metal head glinted faintly, catching some distant, unseen light. We both froze. It hadn't been there a minute ago. We had just walked past that exact spot. We would have seen it. We would have tripped over it. Ethan took a slow step toward it. He reached out a hand, not to grab it, but as if to touch a snake. His fingers brushed the wooden handle. It was real. He wrapped his hand around it and picked it up. He looked from the shovel to me, his face a mask of disbelief and dread. The house was not trying to stop us. It was helping. The moment that thought registered, the moment we both held a tool for the task ahead, a sharp click echoed from inside the house. It was the sound of a circuit breaker tripping. The dim light filtering from the broken living room window vanished. The small safety light over the kitchen sink went dark. We were plunged into a profound, suffocating blackness. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty, it was full. It pressed in on us, a physical presence. The faint, ambient noises of the world, the distant highway, the chirp of a lone cricket, were gone. Erased. There was only the sound of our own breathing and the soft squelch of our shoes in the mud. We stood frozen on the lawn, caught between the dead house and the monstrous waiting tree. My eyes struggled to adjust, but there was no light to adjust to. The oak tree was no longer a shape in the darkness, it was the darkness itself. A solid column of night that seemed to pull all light and sound into it. It stood over the spot where Maya was buried, its guardian, or its warden. Now, Ethan's voice was a dead thing in the black. We started walking. Each step was a plunge into the unknown. The ground seemed to slope downwards, pulling us toward the tree. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp bark and rot. We reached the base of the trunk. It was huge, wider than my arms could reach around. The bark was a landscape of deep gullies and hard ridges. Above us the canopy blotted out the sky, a ceiling of black leaves. We didn't need to guess where. We knew. A spot a few feet from the base of the trunk, where the grass never grew right. Ethan drove his shovel into the ground first. It didn't bite. The spade hit the earth with a dull thud, as if striking stone. He grunted, put his foot on the lip of the shovel, and threw his full weight onto it. The ground barely yielded. I watched his shape strain in the dark. He pulled it out and struck again. Thud. Again. Thud. It's like concrete, he gasped. My turn. I positioned my shovel, aimed for a spot next to a shallow dent, and pushed. The shock of the impact ran up the handle, into my arms, jarring my teeth. The earth was impossibly hard. It wasn't just compacted, it felt petrified. We began a rhythm, a desperate, exhausting battery against the land itself. Ethan would strike. Thud. I would strike. Thump. The sounds were small and dead in the oppressive quiet. Sweat was already beading on my forehead, stinging my eyes. My legs screamed with every shift of my weight. Then came the other sound. It was faint at first. A high, thin sigh that seemed to come from the ground beneath my feet. I stopped, shovel halfway in the air. Did you hear that? Ethan paused, his head cocked. Hear what? I held my breath. There it was again. A whisper carried on a current of air that wasn't moving. It was weak, frayed, like a voice worn thin from screaming. N, 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 O. It was her. It was Maya. S, stop. It's her. I breathed, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. She's telling us to stop. But as her whisper faded, another one began. This one didn't come from the ground. It came from above. From the thousands of leaves rustling in the branches of the great oak. It was not a human sound. It was low, ancient, a dry, rasping sound like stone grinding on stone. It was a voice of immense age and patience. And it was encouraging. Dig. The leaves shivered, a sound like a dry throat clearing. Dig, free me. Two voices. One from the grave, pleading with us to stop. One from the tree, urging us on. A wave of dizziness washed over me. Which one was the warning? Which one was the trap? Don't listen, Ethan grunted, his face a grim shadow. He attacked the ground with renewed fury. It's trying to trick us. He believed the voice from the tree was the house, trying to protect its prize by scaring us off. He believed Maya was the one we had to listen to, that her stop was a misinterpretation, that she needed us to push through. His guilt was a blinder, forcing him toward the one act of penance he could see. He was wrong, so terribly wrong. But I didn't know it then. I only knew we had to choose. I listened to the desperate man beside me, not the desperate whisper from the earth. I raised my shovel. We fell back into the rhythm, ignoring the pleas from below, driven by the dry rustling from above. The work was brutal. We were breaking the earth one painful inch at a time. Clods of dense, root-choked soil came up. They did not smell like dirt. They smelled of the grave. An hour passed. Or maybe a minute. Time had dissolved. There was only the swing of the shovels, the burn in our muscles, the rasp of our own breathing, and the two competing whispers that were now a constant, maddening chorus. Then, a new sound cut through the night. Ethan's shovel struck something that was not earth or root. It made a sharp, clean clank, a sound of metal on stone that echoed in the dead air. He froze, shovel still wedged in the shallow pit. I hit something. We dropped to our knees. The hole was perhaps 2 feet deep, a ragged wound in the earth. Ethan reached in, his hands clawing at the loose dirt. I did the same, my fingers scraping against the cold, unyielding surface he had struck. We worked feverishly, pulling away the soil. It was not a coffin. It was not bone. It was a slab of rock. Flat, dark, and impossibly smooth. It was about 3 feet wide, its full length still buried. But the exposed surface was not natural. It was covered in carvings. Not letters, not symbols I recognized. They were dense, interlocking spirals. Tight, hypnotic patterns that seemed to pulse and writhe in the darkness, drawing the eye inward. They felt older than the tree, older than the hill, older than anything. Ethan reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the carved surface. What is this? Before I could answer, I leaned forward to get a better look, and my right hand, the one with the wound, brushed against the edge of the stone. The contact was electric, but not like before. Not a surge of power, but a draining. A pulling. A sudden sharp agony erupted in my arm. I cried out and snatched my hand back. It was a pain like a wire being pulled tight inside my flesh, a vicious, constricting pressure. I looked down at my arm. The root, the dark punctuation mark in my skin, was changing. It was shriveling. The flesh around it, which had been a bruised purple, was now turning a pale, dead gray. The thing inside me was receding, shrinking, drying up like a slug in salt. The heat, the life, the faint pulse of defiance that had saved me from the monstrous limb, it was all draining out of me, being sucked into the cold, carved stone beneath our hands. The defense was gone. The antibody was dead. We hadn't been digging up a grave. We had been breaking a seal. And in our attempt to free the soul of the victim, we had just unlocked the cage of the monster itself. The pain in my arm was a dead thing, a hollow ache where the fierce, protective heat had been. I pulled my hand back from the stone, cradling it against my stomach. My fingers were cold. The skin on my forearm was slack and gray around the shriveled knot of root. It looked like a corpse's flesh. Ethan was on his knees, his breath a ragged saw in the black. He hadn't touched the stone. He only stared at it, at the interlocking spirals carved into its surface. The patterns hurt the eyes, a nest of snakes, twisting in on themselves. "It's a lid," he said. His voice was a low rasp. "A seal. That's what's trapping her under there." His logic was born of desperation. He saw the draining of my arm, not as a loss of a defense, but as a sign that we were close. That the thing holding Maya was fighting back. His guilt was a set of blinders, forcing his gaze forward toward the only act of service he had left. He needed to get her out. For her. For himself. From deep in the ground, a tremor of a whisper. "No. Leave." Maya's voice. It was weaker now, thinned to a thread by the stone's presence. "We have to move it," he said, ignoring the whisper. He looked at me, his eyes dark holes in his face. "We have to get it off her." I nodded. The gray skin on my arm was spreading. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I only knew the feeling of the life draining out of me, and the sight of Ethan's frantic need. That was all that was real. He got to his feet. "The shovels won't work. Not for this. I need the crowbar." He turned and started jogging back toward the shed, a dark shape against the darker house. I was alone with the stone. The silence that Ethan's footsteps left behind was heavy. It was a weight on my chest. I couldn't hear the crickets. I couldn't hear the distant hum of the highway. The world had shrunk to this small, disturbed patch of ground, the immense watching tree, and this slab of carved night. The spirals on its surface seemed to squirm. I looked away, back at the shallow hole. The dirt we'd dug up was dark and smelled heavy, like spoiled meat and wet clay. A few minutes passed. They felt like hours. I heard his footsteps returning, faster this time. He was carrying a long, dark bar of steel. "Here," he said, not wasting time. He jammed the chisel end of the crowbar into the seam between the slab and the hard-packed earth. "Get a grip on the other side. When I lift, you pull." I knelt, my hands finding the rough, cold edge of the stone. My injured leg throbbed in protest. My good arm felt weak, the muscles like water. "Ready?" he grunted. I nodded. My breath held tight in my chest. "Now." He threw his body weight down on the crowbar. The metal groaned. The stone didn't move. The earth held it in a death grip. "Again," he gasped, sweat dripping from his face. He reset the crowbar, finding a better angle. "Now," he heaved. A loud crack echoed, not of the stone, but of the dirt seal breaking. The slab shifted, just an inch. A foul smell, a century of rot and decay puffed up from the crack. It was a gagging, physical thing that made my eyes water. "It's moving," I choked out. "Keep going." We found a rhythm. He would heave, the crowbar would groan, and the stone would shift a few inches, scraping and grinding against the soil. I pulled, my fingers raw, my back screaming. We weren't just moving a rock. We were opening a door that had been shut for a long, long time. After 10 minutes of brutal, exhausting work, we had dragged it a few feet aside. It sat on the lawn, a dark rectangle of carved madness. Where the slab had been, the ground was different. It was a perfect square of black, loose soil. It looked like freshly tilled earth in a garden bed. There was no resistance here. No compacted clay. No web of roots. Ethan dropped the crowbar and grabbed his shovel. He plunged it into the soft earth. It sank in effortlessly, all the way to the hilt, with a soft, wet shh. The sound was obscene in the quiet. He lifted a shovelful of the rich, black dirt. The smell intensified. He dumped it to the side and plunged the shovel in again. I took my shovel. I joined him. The work was no longer a fight. It was a simple, sickening task. The earth gave way like ash. Shovel in. Dirt out. Shovel in, dirt out. With each layer we removed, the cold from the hole deepened, a cellar cold that clung to our skin. Barely a foot down, my shovel snagged on something. Not a rock. Something soft. I knelt and reached into the loose dirt. My fingers closed around a piece of fabric. It was thin and rotten, slimy to the touch. I pulled it out. Even in the profound dark, I could tell it had once been a light color, maybe with a pattern of flowers. A piece of a summer dress. Maya's dress. Seeing it, holding it, shattered something in Ethan. His movements became frenzied. He was no longer digging. He was clawing, scooping earth out with the shovel blade like a giant spoon. He was a machine made of guilt. I kept digging beside him, my movements slower, more deliberate. My mind was fixed on my right arm. The patch of gray skin had now reached my elbow. The flesh was numb and cold. The shriveled root was barely a fleck of black on the surface. I knew, with a certainty that had no source, that the root had been a graft. A piece of her, of Maya's life force, fused to me in that shared dream, a desperate, last-ditch defense. And now, by digging, by exposing this place to the air, we were killing it. We were killing the last part of her that was still fighting. I should have stopped. I should have screamed at him to stop. But I was mesmerized by the methodical work, by the rhythmic scrape of metal on soft earth. The house was silent. The tree was silent. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath, watching us. There was no encouragement from the leaves now, no whispers from the ground. There was only the sound of our labor and the growing, hollow space in the earth. We were about 4 feet down when Ethan's shovel hit something hard with a dull, organic thump. Not stone. Bone. Fuck, he breathed. We both dropped the shovels. We fell to our knees at the edge of the pit, looking down. We didn't need light to see. The bones seemed to have their own faint luminescence, a pale, milky glow against the black soil. It was a skeleton, curled on its side, as if sleeping. It was almost complete, and it was tangled. Thick, woody roots as dark as the soil had woven themselves through the remains. A root snaked through the empty space between the ribs. Another had wrapped itself around a femur, tight as a tourniquet. They were not the fine, hair-like roots of a normal tree. They were thick, muscular, and intentional. They looked like grasping fingers. We used our hands, scooping away the last of the soft dirt. The air was frigid, reeking of damp earth, and something else. Something chemical and bitter. With a sickening slowness, we uncovered the entire form. The hands were drawn up to the face, the finger bones intermingled with a lattice of fine roots. The skull was turned slightly away from us. A single thick root, the largest of them all, grew down from above. It entered the back of the skull through the foramen magnum where the spinal cord would have been, and emerged out of the right eye socket, a single, dark, cyclopean horn. It pinned the head to the earth below. Ethan let out a sound, a strangled sob. This was it. The physical proof of his sin. The final horror. He reached into the grave, his hands trembling. He began to break the smaller roots, snapping them with his fingers. They broke with dry, cracking sounds. He worked with a feverish intensity, clearing the roots from the limbs, the torso, the hands. I just watched, my cold arm pressed to my side. I was a spectator now. This was his act to finish. He cleared the last of the smaller roots. All that was left was the one large, obscene horn of wood piercing the skull. He looked at me, his face a mess of dirt and tears. "The shovel," he said. His voice was broken. I handed it to him. He positioned the sharp edge of the spade against the root, right where it emerged from the eye socket. He took a breath. He raised the shovel a few inches and brought it down hard. Snap. The sound was not loud, but it was the only sound in the universe. The root severed cleanly. The skull, free for the first time in years, rolled slightly to the side, coming to rest with its empty sockets facing the sky. The moment the root broke, the world ended. Not with a bang. With nothing. The air pressure changed. It felt like being at the bottom of a deep ocean. A pressure on my eardrums, on my skin, on the bones in my skull. Every ambient sound. Our own harsh breathing. The whisper of our clothes. The faint thumping of my own heart. Vanished. It wasn't silence. Silence is an absence of sound. This was a presence. A crushing, heavy, physical null. We were frozen, kneeling at the edge of an open grave in a world without sound. I looked at Ethan. His mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. His face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror. Then, a noise. It came from behind us. from the slab. Tatch. It was a small, dry, sharp sound. Like a pebble striking a window pane. It cut through the heavy null, impossibly clear. Our heads snapped around in unison. We stared at the carved stone slab lying on the grass. A hairline crack had appeared on its surface. It started at one edge and ran halfway to the center, a thin black line against the dark gray stone. As we watched, a second crack branched off from the first. Tatch. Another. Tatch. A web of fine fissures spread across the surface, connecting the hypnotic spirals. And from the main crack, something began to emerge. A single drop of black liquid. It welled up, perfectly round, gleaming under a light that didn't exist. It was not the thin, watery fluid that had wept from the walls of the house. This was thick, oily. It didn't drip. It held its shape for a long moment, and then it began to move, creeping along the surface of the stone like a drop of living tar. Another bead of it welled up beside the first, and then another. A slow, black bleeding from the heart of the stone. We had not set a victim free. We had broken the lock on the cage. The sound of my own blood in my ears was a loud, static hiss that replaced the world. The pressure did not yield. It pinned us in place, kneeling at the edge of the pit. My eyes were locked on the stone slab. The black beads of liquid oozed from the new cracks, refusing to fall, clinging to the surface like tumors. They quivered. Ethan moved first. His guilt was a stronger force than the unnatural pressure. He turned his back on the slab, his gaze fixed on the hole, on the pale bones lying in the loose soil. He had to finish this. That was the only thought his mind could form. "Get the sheet," he ordered. His voice was gone, just a rasp of air forced from his lungs. I heard the words more through their vibration in the ground than through my ears. I didn't want to move. I wanted to stay frozen, to pretend this wasn't happening, to stare at the weeping stone until it or I ceased to exist. But his command was a hook that pulled me out of the paralysis. I pushed myself to my feet. My legs were numb. I stumbled back toward the house, my eyes still fixed on the scene. Ethan was already climbing carefully into the 4-foot grave. The back door was ajar. Inside, the house was dark. I fumbled through the laundry room, my hands searching for the utility closet. I found an old canvas drop cloth we used for painting. It was stiff and smelled of dust and dried latex. It was big enough. I dragged it out, not bothering to fold it. When I got back outside, Ethan was arranging the bones. He handled them with a strange reverence, a gentleness that was terrifying in its focus. He laid the femurs side by side, pieced the delicate cage of ribs together, and placed the skull at the top. He worked with the concentration of a museum curator assembling a dinosaur. He was building the effigy of his sin. The pressure in the air had lessened slightly, or maybe I was just getting used to it. The heavy null had receded, replaced by an awareness of noise. The crackle of the canvas as I unfolded it beside the pit. The soft scrape of bone on bone as Ethan made his final adjustments. I looked at my right arm. The gray, dead patch of flesh was gone. The shriveled knot of root that had been embedded in my skin had vanished without a trace. In its place was a scar. A smooth, pale, perfectly white shape on my forearm. It was not a violent scar, but it was profoundly wrong. It looked like the skin of a fish, stark and alien against my own. A brand. The last vestige of her defense, now just a dead mark. "It's ready," Ethan said. Together we lowered the canvas drop cloth into the pit. He climbed out. We stood on opposite sides of the grave. He knelt and began to slide the bones onto the center of the canvas. The vertebrae. The thin bones of the hands. The hip. Each one moved with a dry whisper against the fabric. When he was done, we had a pile of human remains on a painter's cloth. All that was left in the pit was the severed stump of the thick root. It jutted from the soil, black and slick, like a severed artery. A brief, manic sense of accomplishment took hold of Ethan. His breathing was still ragged, but his movements were purposeful. "We just have to get her out of here," he said, talking to himself. "A proper place, not here." We each took 2 corners of the canvas. "Lift," he commanded. We pulled. The weight was minimal, no more than a bag of laundry. But it felt immense. We were lifting a secret into the open air, We laid the heavy bundle on the grass a few feet from the open grave, then began to fold the corners over, creating a crude shroud. He worked quickly, tucking the edges in, securing the remains from sight. We had done it. We had freed her. That was when the tree screamed. It wasn't a sound, it was a visual shockwave. We were looking down at our work, but a sudden, total change in the light made us look up. The great oak, the silent watcher, was dying. The leaves, every single one, were turning black. Not the slow fade of autumn, but an instantaneous, chemical burn. The green leached out, replaced by a brittle, light-sucking matte black. A ripple of this transformation spread from the trunk to the outermost branches in the space of a single heartbeat. Then they fell. They did not flutter down. They detached all at once, a billion black flakes dropping in a dead straight silent rain. In 2 seconds, the mighty oak was stripped bare. It stood against the night sky as a skeleton, a gnarled, black, and utterly dead thing. The fallen leaves did not form a carpet on the lawn. Where they touched the grass, they dissolved, turning into a black, greasy smudge before vanishing completely. The lawn around the base of the tree was now a circle of dead, black earth. My gaze snapped back to the stone slab. It was no longer just cracking. The web of fissures covered its entire surface now, like a shattered windshield. The black liquid wasn't seeping anymore. It poured from the cracks, a steady flow that had created a pulsing, inky puddle on the grass beside it. The puddle was growing. This wasn't a release. This wasn't a cleansing. The ground beneath my feet trembled. A low, deep vibration that worked its way up through the soles of my shoes, into my bones. It was the purr of a massive engine coming to life deep within the earth. The house groaned. A long, structural lament of twisting wood and straining nails. It was the sound of a sleeping behemoth shifting in its slumber. Maya hadn't been the prisoner. She had been the bars on the cage. The bundle of bones at our feet was not a soul we had set free. It was the lock we had just picked. "Ethan," I whispered, the name a dry stick in my throat. He saw it too. His face, which a moment before had held a flicker of desperate hope, was now a mask of pure, childlike bewilderment. He stared at the skeletal tree, at the bleeding stone, at the groaning house. He had been so focused on atoning for the one small human evil he had committed, he had never imagined the larger inhuman one he was about to unleash. The slab did not crack further. It exploded. There was no loud bang. Just a dull thump, like a giant fist punching through drywall, and the carved stone disintegrated into 1,000 pieces of gravel and dust. In its place, where it had lain for a century, there was now a column of blackness. It was not smoke. It was a pillar of pure absence, a hole in the world that shot upward into the night sky. It pulled at the light, at the air, at our sanity. The ground erupted. The entire lawn, from the back porch to the edge of the woods, dissolved. The grass, the soil, the neat flower beds. It all turned to a churning, bubbling morass of black mud. It wasn't wet. It was thick, a heaving tide of earth that moved with a sickening intestinal slowness. Sucking sounds echoed as pockets of air were swallowed. Then, the hands came. Dozens of them. They punched up through the mud, not like zombies clawing from a grave, but like roots bursting forth with violent, preternatural speed. They were not flesh. They were made of the same black, muscular root that had threaded Maya's bones, packed with wet clay and small stones. They were jointed like human hands, with 5 distinct fingers, but they moved with a twitching, alien motion of spiders. They rose on thick, wrist-like stalks, turning this way and that, feeling the air. More burst from the ground. Soon the entire yard was a forest of writhing, grasping appendages. Ethan screamed. It was not a word. It was the sound of a mind snapping. One of the hands, thicker and faster than the rest, shot out of the mud right beside the canvas shroud. Its root fingers closed around the bundle. With a single brutal jerk it yanked the bones down. The canvas and its contents vanished beneath the surface of the churning muck. A wet slurp was the only sound it made. She was gone. Not freed, reclaimed. We were standing on the small stone patio by the back door, a tiny island in a sea of nightmares. Ethan turned and scrambled for the slider door. He pulled the handle. Nothing. He threw his shoulder against it. The glass shuddered but held fast. Wh-you-h, yump. The kitchen window slammed shut. Whump. The dining room window. Whump, whump, whump. Every window on the back of the house, one after another, slammed down with the force of a guillotine. The shutters we had never closed snapped into place over them. a final, percussive volley of denial. The sound echoed from inside the house as well, the distant slam of the front door, the upstairs windows. The house was sealing itself, locking us out. We were trapped, not in the house, but with it, with the thing it had contained. The vibration in the earth intensified, the mud churned faster, and from the ground itself, from the heaving soil and the grasping hands and the skeletal tree, a new sound began. It started as a low chuckle, a chorus of faint, scratching whispers. But it grew, layering on top of itself. The gurgle of a drowning man, the scream of a terrified child, the low moan of agony, the sharp cry of sudden pain. Hundreds of voices. Thousands of them, all the suffering this ground had ever tasted, blended into a single, cohesive, multi-toned sound. It was a chord of pure misery, and it was laughing. It laughed at our work, at our hope, at our staggering, idiotic mistake. Ethan stared at the house, his hands pressed against the glass of the door he could not open. His body shook. I stood behind him, my feet cemented to the patio stones. The white scar on my arm was beginning to itch. Less than / footer greater than. The laughter was a physical thing. It did not echo in the air, but in the ground, a deep, resonant vibration that pulsed up through the stone patio, through the soles of my shoes and into my teeth. It was a chord made of 1,000 broken sounds. The grating of stone on bone, the wet gasp of a final breath, the high, thin shriek of terror, all woven together into one harmonious expression of amusement. Ethan collapsed against the sliding glass door. The impact made a flat, hopeless sound. His body slid down the glass, leaving a smear, and he landed in a heap on the stones. His hands covered his head, his knuckles white. He was trying to block out the sound, but it was inside him now. It was inside the world. We were on an island. A small gray slab of patio stone in a churning black sea. The lawn was gone, replaced by a heaving mass of mud and grasping appendages. The root hands, made of dark fiber and impacted clay, pushed up from the mire on wrist-thick stalks. They did not reach for us. They simply felt the air, turning and flexing their stony fingers in a slow, exploratory dance. The forest of them grew denser, their numbers swelling until the entire yard was a writhing field of them. The small island of stone beneath my feet shuddered. I looked down. A hairline crack appeared between two flagstones, and a line of black ooze, thick as tar, seeped up through it. The ground was giving way. The patio was not a foundation. It was a raft, and it was sinking. The air, already heavy, grew thicker. It carried a new smell, not just of damp soil but of deeper things. The cloying sweetness of decay. The cold, mineral scent of a freshly opened crypt. The faint coppery tang of old, spilled blood. The house moaned again. It was no longer the sound of a structure settling. It was the groan of a living body. I watched, unable to move, as the siding on the rear wall began to distend. The vinyl planks bowed outward, the space between them widening, the nails holding them in place screaming with a high-pitched metallic shriek. Then, with a slow, sucking contraction, the wall pulled back in. The motion was rhythmic, measured. The house was breathing. The windows on the second floor bulged, the glass flexing outward like giant, milky cataracts before receding. It was watching us. It was toying with us. Ethan made a noise, a choked sob. He had lowered his hands. His face was turned toward the yard. I followed his gaze. Something was happening in the mud. The constant, chaotic churning was slowing. The motion becoming localized to one area directly in front of us. The mud there began to swell, rising like dough. The grasping root hands in that section sank back down, reabsorbed into the mass. The mound of earth grew, darkening, compacting. Then forms began to resolve on its surface. They were not clear. They were low-relief sculptures made of shifting soil and slick clay, like a bas-relief from a nightmare. I saw a figure, large and misshapen. It had the broad shoulders and basic shape of a man. Of Ethan. It moved with a lurching, brutal slowness. Another, smaller shape rose before it. A woman. She was kneeling. The mud Ethan raised a muddy limb, and in its hand was a shape of packed earth. A rock. A whisper slithered out from the concoction. A sound like dirt sliding down a chute. "It's your fault." The mud Ethan brought the rock down. There was no impact sound, just the viscerally clear image of the smaller shape collapsing, its form dissolving back into the churning surface. The larger figure stood over it for a moment, then began to furiously work, clawing at the mud, digging, pushing the broken form down, burying it. The image was a caricature, a grotesque exaggeration. It twisted Ethan's panicked, guilt-ridden act into one of monstrous, deliberate cruelty. The vision made him a demon. "You brought death here," the whispers hissed, bubbling up from a dozen places at once. "You fed me." "No," Ethan breathed. The word was a puff of steam in the cool night air. He scrambled backward, crab walking away from the glass door, away from the vision in the mud. His eyes were wide, fixed on the horrifying pantomime of his own greatest sin. No, that's not. I didn't." The mud sculpture held its form for a few more seconds, a monument to his guilt. Then it collapsed. The entire mound of earth seemed to liquefy, the figures dissolving as a new, more violent motion began. The ground convulsed. All of the earth that had formed the sick play, and more from the surrounding yard, began to pull inward to a single point. It was a whirlpool of soil and stone and root. Sucking, slurping sounds echoed as the mass compacted, rising upward. The remaining root hands across the yard were ripped from their anchorages and pulled into the vortex, their forms shredding as they were assimilated. The mass rose. It was no longer a mound, it was a column. It drew itself up, defying gravity, mud and rocks and splintered roots weaving together like muscle fibers. It took on a shape. 2 thick legs, a massive torso, 2 long, pendulous arms. A head. It straightened to its full height, a giant forged from the tormented land itself, easily 12 feet tall. It stood in the center of the yard, water and black ooze running in rivulets down its earthen skin. It had no face, no eyes, no nose. Where its mouth should have been, there was only a hole. A dark, circular maw, a pit of absence in the center of its head. It was a doorway to nothing. The giant was a shell, an automaton of earth animated by the ancient hungry thing that lived beneath it. It took a step. The ground shook. Each footfall was a dull, seismic thump that vibrated through the patio stones. It was coming for us. For me. But Ethan moved first. The sight of the approaching behemoth seemed to sever the last thread of his paralysis. The terror was replaced by something else. A final, desperate surge of purpose. All the guilt, all the fear, all the responsibility for what he had unleashed, focused into one single point. He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time since the slab had exploded. It was a look of apology and command. He spotted the fire poker, part of a wrought iron set we had left near the back door, now half knocked over. He lunged for it, his movements suddenly fluid. His hand closed around the heavy iron shaft. The giant took another step. The patio stones groaned, and the crack between them widened. "Run!" Ethan screamed. The word was pure, a blade of sound that cut through the chorus of whispers. He didn't look to see if I obeyed. He turned, brandishing the poker like a spear, and charged. He ran off the sinking patio, his feet sinking into the black mud, and launched himself directly at the creature. It was the most futile, most valiant thing I had ever seen. A man attacking a mountain, a final, closing gesture of atonement. The giant did not raise its arms to defend itself. It did not strike back. As Ethan's desperate charge brought him within a few feet of its massive body, the creature simply tilted its head down and opened its mouth. The hole widened. The aperture of darkness stretched, the earthen clay around it pulling back like lips. A sudden, violent inrush of air created a vacuum. Ethan's forward momentum was arrested, then reversed. He was pulled off his feet, his body flying horizontally toward the maw. He didn't even have time to scream again. The fire poker was ripped from his grasp, sucked into the darkness first. Then him. He vanished completely into the hole. There was no crunch, no sound of impact. Just a quiet whoosh as the air rushed in to fill the space where he had been. He was gone. Deleted. The maw snapped shut, the earth sealing itself back into a faceless mask. The giant stood motionless in the center of the yard. The black mud around its feet slowly stopped churning. The whispers died. The house ceased its breathing. An almost stillness fell over the backyard, broken only by the soft, wet dripping of ooze from the creature's body. I was frozen, my back pressed against the cold glass of the door. My mind refused to process what it had just seen. Ethan. Gone. Swallowed by the very ground he had tried to appease. Then the creature moved. Its head, a solid block of rock and soil, swiveled slowly on its thick neck. The motion was accompanied by a low, grinding sound, stone scraping against stone. It turned its featureless face directly toward me. There were no eyes to see with, but I felt its attention. A focused, patient, and utterly inhuman consideration. It had dealt with the sinner. Now it was looking at the witness. It took another step, its massive foot landing on the edge of the patio. The flagstones tilted violently, cracking under the immense weight. I stumbled, catching myself on the doorframe. I was trapped. The house behind me was a tomb. The yard before me was my executioner. A sharp sensation cut through the fog of my terror. An itch. I looked down at my right forearm. The scar, the pale fish-scale patch of skin that Maya had left behind, was now bright red. A network of tiny black veins pulsed beneath its surface, and the skin was hot to the touch. It burned with a fierce, insistent fire. The brand was awake. It was a part of me. And it was singing to the thing in the yard. I did not scream. The sound was lodged somewhere in my throat, a solid object I couldn't move. My muscles were locked, my back fused to the cold glass of the sliding door. The thing in the yard, the walking grave that had swallowed my husband, stood motionless. It studied me with a face that was not a face. It had processed the center, now it considered the loose end. The burning on my forearm intensified. It was a hot, sharp sting, a beacon in the cold night. The pale patch of skin, Maya's brand, pulsed with a dull, red light only I could see. A feverish throb that seemed to answer the creature's silent question. A terrible communion was taking place between my flesh and the monstrous earth. The giant took a step. Its foot, a slab of compacted soil and rock, landed on the edge of the stone patio. The flagstones screamed. A web of cracks shot out from the point of impact. The entire slab of stone tilted under my feet, pitching me forward. I caught myself on the door handle, my knuckles white. Then, the creature began to come apart. It wasn't a violent explosion. It was a surrender. A slow, gravitational collapse. The mud and clay of its shoulders sloughed off in wet sheets, falling to the ground with heavy, plopping sounds. Its arms sagged, the woven roots within them unraveling, and they dissolved into the churning muck below. The massive torso buckled inward. The featureless head drooped, then sank into the collapsing chest, disappearing like a stone into water. The entire form liquefied, a 12-foot column of animated earth melting back into a formless, heaving mound. The mound itself then flattened, the last of its height receding, the mud spreading out and sinking down until all that was left was a churned, violated lawn. The house behind me exhaled a final, shuddering groan and fell still. The whispers from the ground faded to nothing. The air cleared, losing its scent of crypts and decay, leaving only the clean, sharp smell of cool night and damp earth. The world had returned. A broken, brutalized version of it, but it was the world I knew. The patio was a shattered wreck. The lawn was a mess of gouged soil and upturned sod. On the glass door beside me, a long, greasy smear marked the spot where Ethan's body had slid down. That was all that was left of him. A smear. My mind was a white, flat surface. It held the single, looping image of Ethan flying into the dark maw. Him. Then the poker, gone. Deleted. I pushed the image down. There was no room for it. There was only the need to move. To not be here when the ground decided to play again. A sound cut through the night. A low, metallic groan, followed by a sharp click. It came from the end of the driveway, 100 yards away. I looked. Under the single, dim anemic light that marked the entrance to our property, the wrought iron gate was swinging open. It moved slowly, deliberately, opening inward, revealing the black ribbon of the country road beyond. It was an invitation, a dismissal. The game was over. The cat was bored with the mouse. It was letting me go. That knowledge broke the paralysis. My legs unlocked. A single, primal command screamed through my veins. Run! I scrambled off the tilted patio, my feet slipping on the broken stone. I landed in the soft, torn earth of the lawn, the mud sucking at my sneakers. I didn't care. I ran. I ran past the septic tank cover where this had all begun. I ran over the spot where the geyser of mud and bone had erupted. I ran without looking back, convinced that if I turned, I would see the ground rising up behind me, a silent, earthen wave poised to swallow me whole. My lungs burned. My breath came in ragged, painful gasps. The sound of my own panic, my frantic breathing, and the pounding of my feet on the gravel driveway filled the world. I reached the gate. It stood wide open, a black archway framing my escape. I didn't slow. I burst through it and onto the hard, solid asphalt of the road. The feeling of the unyielding surface under my feet was the most reassuring thing I had ever felt. It was real. It was civilization. It was not alive. I ran down the center of the dark road, a desperate figure under a black, starless sky. I didn't know which way I was going. It didn't matter. All that mattered was a way. Headlights. Two beams of piercing white, growing larger, coming up the road behind me. For a second, a new terror seized me. A car. From the house. But the sound was wrong. It was a deep, guttural rumble, the sound of a diesel engine. I skidded to a stop, turning, waving my arms frantically. It was a semi-truck, its massive grille, a chrome wall bearing down on me. I stood my ground, a wild, disheveled silhouette in the high beams. The hiss of air brakes was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The Kenworth rig pulled to a stop 20 feet from me, its engine idling like a sleeping beast. The passenger door swung open. "Jesus Christ, lady, you trying to get killed?" A man's voice boomed from the high cab. I couldn't answer. I just stared, shaking, my throat still clamped shut. "You in trouble? You need help?" he asked, his tone shifting from angry to concerned. I managed to nod, a violent, jerky motion. "Well, get in before someone else doesn't see you." Climbing into the cab was like ascending to another world. It was warm. The air smelled of stale coffee, vinyl, and cheap pine tree air freshener. It was the smell of normalcy. The driver was a big man in his 50s, with a kind, weathered face and a stained baseball cap. He looked at me, taking in my mud-caked legs, my torn shirt, my wild eyes. He didn't press, he just put the truck in gear, and with another hiss of air, we pulled away. I watched the wrought iron gate of our driveway shrink in the side mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. Gone. I was out. I was safe. I huddled against the passenger door, my body racked with tremors I couldn't control. The heater blasted warm air onto my feet. The driver, whose name I saw was Frank, on a name tag stuck to the dash, occasionally glanced at me. He had the radio on, a low talk show murmur that was a comforting drone of human voices. He offered me a bottle of water. I took it, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the cap off. He took it back, opened it for me, and handed it to me. I drank, the cool water a shock to my system. I tried to say thank you, but only a dry rasp came out. He just nodded. "Take it easy, we'll get you to the state police barracks up in Somerville." I nodded and stared out the window, watching the dark trees flash by. Safe. The word echoed in my head, but it felt hollow, a lie. You don't just walk away from something like that. There is no away. I looked down at my hands, clasped in my lap. They were filthy, caked with the dark, rich soil of the yard. The same soil that had formed the creature. The same soil that had swallowed Ethan. The grime was packed under my fingernails. A piece of my nightmare, right here with me in the sterile warmth of the truck cab. My gaze fell to my right forearm. The burning had subsided to a dull, persistent itch. The pale, scaly patch of skin stood out against the dirt smudges. As I watched, a muscle deep beneath the scar twitched. It wasn't my muscle. It was a small, subcutaneous ripple, like a worm moving under the skin. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. It happened again. A distinct, undulating movement right in the center of the scar tissue. The skin there seemed to thin, to become translucent. I could see something dark just beneath the surface. With a slowness that felt obscene, the skin began to part. There was no blood. Just a neat, clean separation, the pale flesh pulling back like a curtain. From the tiny opening something began to emerge. It was not a splinter. It was not a root. It was a sprout. A tiny, tightly furrowed bud, the color of a deep bruise, black-green and slick. It pushed its way out of my arm, millimeter by millimeter. A living thing growing from my own flesh. It looked hard, almost mineral, its leaves pointed and sharp. It was a piece of the yard. A piece of the house. It was growing out of me. A choked sound escaped my lips, half gasp, half sob. "You all right over there?" Frank, the driver, asked, his eyes flicking from the road to me and back again. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't tear my eyes from the horrid little growth on my arm. A silent, frantic terror, colder and sharper than anything I had felt in the yard, seized me. This wasn't over. This was a new beginning. My head snapped up. I looked past Frank at the rectangular side view mirror mounted outside his window. I needed to see my own face. I needed to see the horror in my own eyes to prove this was real. But the face in the mirror was not mine. For a split second it was a blur of features, and then they resolved. It was a woman's face. Pale skin. Dark, lank hair plastered to her forehead. And her eyes, they were dark, placid pools. There was no panic in them, no fear, nothing. It was the face of Maya. The woman Ethan had buried. The original victim. The original host. As I watched, frozen, the reflection's lips pulled back from its teeth. It was not a smile. It was a baring of teeth. A gesture of cold, predatory ownership. And then, a voice spoke. It didn't come from the radio. It wasn't the driver. It bloomed inside my own skull, a clear, calm whisper that was not my own thought. It never lets anyone go. The truck rumbled on into the night, carrying me away, carrying us. I was no longer a witness. I was the evidence. I was no longer a victim. I was the vessel. The ground hadn't let me escape. It had just found a way to spread its seeds.